Thank you for joining us for this important conversation on the legacy of Jonathan Edwards. My name is Chris Chun, the director of Jonathan Edwards Center at Gateway Seminary, and today we will be examining the issue of slavery in the American early period, assessing how modern readers ought to interact with Edwards' position. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our panel speaker today. First is Dr. Ken Minkema. He is the foremost expert on this historical question, as well as the executive director of Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale University. He will be joining us from Connecticut. And next we have Pastor James Westbrook. He's the lead pastor, Realm Church near Oakland and San Francisco Bay Area. He actually is a graduate of Gateway Seminary and took my Edwards class several years ago. He has some really keen insight on this topic, and he'll be joining us from Oakland, California. And the last but not the least, Dr. Leroy Gainey. He is a senior professor of educational leadership at Gateway Seminary, and he has been teaching for seminary for almost over 30 years. Dr. Gainey is actually the first trustee elected professor in all of SBC history. So we have a legend who's joining us. And he actually is zooming in from Las Vegas today. And I'm here in my home, comfort of my home in Southern California, and zooming in from my office. We are really an honor to have our distinguished guest here. And thank you for coming to our digital panel discussion.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Our joy, brother. Our joy.
Well, Jonathan Edwards was a pastor, a revivalist, philosopher, missionary, and many tout him as the greatest theologian yet to grace in American scene. He has been celebrated by many, diverse culture and global community. And this is why it's surprising and even disappointing to find out that he did have a feet of clay. And today, I'd like us to focus on Jonathan Edwards' feet of clay. So my first question is for Dr. Minkema. You once told me that you started your Edwards class at Yale by asking this question: why should you listen to a slaveholder? And I'm just wondering, why do you do that?
Well, I know that some people would object outright to the idea of taking anything from a person who felt it was legitimate to hold another person in bondage. I asked this question to get at the issue of historical imagination and some empathy, right? So Edwards was indeed a slave owner and justified slavery biblically, as many people of that time did. Edwards lived at a time where slavery had been practiced since ancient times, and in virtually every country in the world. So that's one thing we have to understand. But more to the point, Edwards was a very important figure historically, and I think it's important for us to engage with these figures. Now, Edwards, there's no denying, had great influence and impact in the time that he lived and in the time since he's lived. And that in and of itself, I think it makes it a very imperative for us to engage him. Now, as a historian, I am a historian. Um, I'm interested in getting my students to understand people of the past in their own terms, on their own terms, to understand as much as possible their beliefs and their actions, why they believed and acted the way they did. That provides a basis for understanding ourselves and for understanding how we can move forward, what we can take from the past and move forward with, what we can leave behind as well, just as importantly, right? What we can improve upon there. So this act of historical imagination, I think, is a very important one. Now, there are theologians and philosophers and ethicists and others who appropriate Edwards's thought for their own purposes, especially for their own constructive purposes. And there too, that's an act of selectivity, right? It seems that they can choose to take what is instructive and what is beautiful and hopefully what is true in the thought of Edwards or of anyone in the past who is flawed and who isn't flawed, of course, but and they can use that hopefully and turn that to the enlightenment of their own times. So these are some of the issues that are involved in dealing with it, recognizing it, realizing it was an evil, realizing it was a sin, but then saying, okay, well, how can we then constructively and legitimately draw on someone who has done this, and but someone who, by the same token, has had such a huge impact on the history of Christian thought. You know,
Yes.
many put him on a parallel on the same plane with Augustine and Aquinas and Calvin and Luther and so forth. So deal with those things. So those are some of the issues that are involved there for me.
Yes. Yes. Okay, that makes sense. Now, Pastor Westbrook, um, you were a student in my Edwards class several years ago, and I remember you had quite the admiration for him. My question is, how did you come to love Jonathan Edwards?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question because it is a part of not only my academic history, but part of my present reality as well, my pastorate. Uh, but like many, before engaging Edwards seriously, I think my only knowledge of Edwards was vicariously through John Piper, or characters like John Piper, or sermons like "Sinners in the Hymn of the Angry God." I think that's the only thing I had actually known about Edwards, with some other historical sprinklings, if you will. It wasn't until I actually took your class and actually learned a greater deal about Edwards, engaged with the mind of Edwards and his work, his legacy, that I actually grew to admire him. And so it was more of a historical curiosity. My undergrad is in philosophical studies as well as history. And so that's what drew me to a person like Edwards from what I had heard about him. But it wasn't until I took the class that I came to admire Edwards so greatly. Now that is ironic in light of the fact of our current conversation. It's also ironic, in light of the fact that I'm engaging with him for the first time and reading at least of those early years. I think it was, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Minkema, I think that was 1738 when he purchased, I think, Venus, his first slave. 1731. Okay, very good, thank you. And so yes, I read that to a great disappointment, but still grew in my admiration for him. Now, here's why. I think the word here for myself and for I think all African Americans or Americans of African descent we've had to live with this word or live in this reality, not just us, but I'm speaking for African Americans. This word is duality. We've always had to exist in great duality. And so I think that while reading and researching and grappling with Edwards' thoughts, I lamented that Edward had participated and justified slavery in what he did, and how he did. Um, and we can talk about that, parse that out a little bit more later. But I also, at the same time, lamenting this reality of Edwards, I lavished also in his great philosophical genius. So I think that living in the tension and living in this duality is something that came more natural to me. And so, because it's something that I think that we've always had to do. And so I think I'll talk more about why that's even possible, that tension. But that's really the reason why.
The question that I have for Dr. Gainey is when was the first time you have heard of Jonathan Edwards, and what do you think of him?
Well, I first got introduced to Jonathan Edwards when I started teaching at Golden Gate. Gateway was Golden Gate. And that would have been in 1987. And I have been teaching this course called The Foundations of Christian Education or Educational Leadership, which dealt with almost all of the disciplines from psychology to theology to philosophy and to history. And it was in the history portion that I primarily had my introduction to Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening period. Not so much knowing about him or even desiring to bring him out as an educator, because that wasn't his primary contribution to the church, at least as I saw it. But that his contribution in terms of the Great Awakening and his scholarship, his intellectual, his great mind, was definitely one that one would deal with. Now, if I could just back up for a minute, Dr. Chung, and I want to go back to something when you were introducing me, and that I am the first trustee elected African-American professor in Southern Baptist history, not the first professor. The first professor was a very good friend of mine by the name of T. Walker, who was at Southern, and he came in 1986. But he wasn't trustee elected until I think it is 94, 95, which was a number of years after me. And I just think, for the record, I just want to bring that out because we were very good friends, and we teased one another over that issue and so forth, and talked a lot about the issue of, being in the role that we were and the responsibility that we had to seminarians, and especially African-American seminarians. My background is education, but I also was an African-American scholar. I had 2 fellowships at Syracuse University. And so I understand slavery in depth. I have read firsthand sources from the American slave. And so I've heard from, those many of the slaves that were left because there weren't a lot of autobiographies written by slaves, and for obvious reasons being so. But I do want to make it plain that at least from what I bring to this discussion, and that is when we say the term slavery, I think there are all kinds of depictions that are conjured in our minds in terms of the treatment of people who were in bondage. Probably none of those are accurate. And what I mean by that is there's nothing that was good about slavery, and that slaves did not enjoy their relationship of being in bondage. In 10,000 slave testimonies that I have read in the American slave, none of them not one of them mentioned about enjoying slavery. It was a very terrible institution. Slaves were not treated well. The ones that were treated the worst would be probably slaves like the ones that Jonathan Edwards owned, because they trusted people who were thought to be nice to them, and that probably made promises to them that one day they were going to be liberated and all of these things. And I just think that it is good for us to understand that most of the history was written by Anglo patriarchy, and not from the position of the slave or from the common people. And so we don't get that history. We don't get that downtroddenness. We don't get that horrific picture. And that needs to be told. I'm not saying that Jonathan Edwards or Thomas Jefferson or any of these people that owned slaves need to be canceled, but we need to understand that there was nothing that was good about being a slave. Mm-hmm. And that's from the whole trip, the middle voyage, being stolen from your land, possibly being thrown in the sea because you rebelled. So you're not going to get the history. There are a lot of people who were not a part of abolitionist movements and so forth as we know them, and written from Anglo, perspectives, and which was good, but there was nobody who agreed with slavery that came from Africa. There was nobody that was brought here that came here not brought in chains. And so we're not talking about a system that people just went along in order to get along. It was a very terrible, terrible system. And people like myself, people like Pastor Westbrook, we look the way we do because when you have people who are enslaved, it is not just for their labor. It is not just for political power, being 2/5 of a man or whatever it was that the Constitution said that you're a human being, but there were 3/5. But there was also the sexual issue. And if you read work like from people like Tamora Lomax in her book, Jezebel, who is the chairperson of, co-chairperson of the African American Studies Department at Michigan State University, you find out that these women were raped every day. And that's why people like myself, people like Westbrook, we look the way we do because we are a mixed people. So there was nothing enjoyable about this. There was nothing that was, no matter how much it was said that this was a good system or that it was an enjoyable system or slaves are treated well, it just was not so.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Gainey. That's certainly, it's assumed that it's not an enjoyable system. It's abhorrent, for sure. But you talked about the abolitionist movement, and the question that I want to ask Dr. Minkema is were there anti-slavery theologians during Edwards' time? And the question that I also want to ask in light of that is, how strong, how prevalent was the abolitionist voice in the early 18th century? I wonder.
So, there's a lot to unpack here. I would just second what Dr. Gainey said about silencing the past is not the answer. Too long, white scholars and apologists have silenced Black voices, and that needs to stop. Where we have even today, efforts to silence the 1619 Project, or a new executive order that declares that teaching racial diversity sensitivity is unpatriotic. I mean, these are just horrendous notions. We should just back up a little bit if I could, Chris.
Okay.
So the definition of slavery for usually was a person enslaved was either a criminal or a debtor or a war captive or a child of a slave, right? These were the kind of the working definitions. This system, this institution was biblically justified, as Dr. Gaines said. So many apologists for this use the Bible in some horrendous ways to justify slavery. Fairly typical, right? This was a fairly long standing in Edwards's time, before Edwards's time, and following up through the Civil War. The difference here, the new dimension, was the slave trade. That is when they went beyond the traditional definition of who is a slave to going into Africa and actually stealing people, right? Going in and taking them forcibly from Africa. This dimension was especially horrendous. Nonetheless, it was justified by some as saying, well, this will be a means of Christianizing the people that we're enslaving. So this is actually a good thing. A specious argument, if ever I heard one, because again, and I'll hear a second again what Dr. Gaines said, the reality was, slavery, the slave trade, and the enslavement of people was nothing but brutality and exploitation, right? There may have been talk of being Christian masters. Edwards was one of these who talked about trying to be a Christian master. George Whitefield was another. And there were a number of people who were trying to try to humanize the slave ownership. It really didn't work. Ultimately, that was a futile kind of effort, because power corrupts, and the power of one person over another corrupts and leads to brutality and exploitation of all kinds, physical, sexual, and so forth. Now, in terms of justifying slavery, Edwards did appeal to Scripture, but we'll get into this a little later. That he begins to have some differing ideas. So, but during his time, people who opposed that is Europeans or Anglo-Americans who opposed slavery were very few on the ground indeed. We can cite people like some of the pietists in Pennsylvania, the Germantown petition of 1688, for example, from the Quakers, led by Daniel Pastorius, was one important, very early example of anti-slavery expression. They actually were interesting because they equated, or they linked freedom from persecution because of religious belief with freedom from forced labor, right? They had come out of their own background of religious persecution in Europe and had come to Pennsylvania to establish, to live and worship by their own lights. And they made that link between themselves, their own experience, and the experience of the enslaved, and thereby said slavery in all its aspects is totally wrong. They used New Testament tenets and they used Christian ethics for these arguments. They even said, for example, that slaves have the right to revolt, which was like unheard of at that time. And it was small wonder, therefore, that this petition was conveniently buried in the records of the local meeting there for a while. Then there were others like Samuel Sewell of Boston, a judge, probably most known for being one of the judges at the Salem witchcraft trials. But Sewell was also opposed very much to the slave trade and to some aspects of slavery. Being a legal person, he was very involved in how do we legally define slavery, who's the subject of slavery, and so forth. He came down very squarely against the slave trade, and as I say, against some aspects of enslavement under certain circumstances. But quite typical of the time, he was anti-misogynistic. He opposed the integration of races and said it would be better if we just kept apart. So very much an anti-integrationist kind of mentality. This was very pervasive at the time. You have to understand that. It's a very important thing to understand. So these were fairly uncommon individuals, as I say, though. Some others, like maybe Cotton Mather, too, had some real reservations about slavery, but did what he could, according to his own lights anyway, to try to relieve the suffering and the plight of African and African Americans in slavery, and of free blacks too, by gathering together into reform societies and things like this. But these obviously were only halfway kinds of measures. During the 18th century, at least the first half of it, there was no kind of a concerted anti-slavery movement. That they really did not occur until the early 19th century.
Okay, so 19th century was really the beginnings of the abolitionist movement, would you say?
That's correct. It really didn't begin until the early Republic, till the antebellum period, and in any kind of real concentrated way until the 1830s.
1830.
Yeah.
Okay. So we know that Edward was a slave owner, but I wonder, is there some evidence, historical evidence, that he was evolving on this issue? You mentioned that he grew up defending slavery and so on.
Right. So, as Reverend Westbrook mentions, Edwards purchased his first slave in 1731, traveling from his the town where he pastored in Northampton, Massachusetts, to Newport, Rhode Island, which was fast becoming a major entrepot for the slave trade in the Americas. We usually think of slavery and the slave trade as associated with the southern colonies and later the southern states. But we have to also recognize that the northern colonies and the northern states were just as culpable, just as involved, because it was in the hulls of New England ships that the great majority of slaves were brought over from Africa to the Americas, right? And it was in places like Newport where they were put on auction and sold, either to be disseminated into the New England countryside, or much more, to be sold south to places like the Carolinas or the Caribbean, especially, to support the tobacco and the sugarcane industries in those areas. So that's one thing to say about Edward. He had no qualms then at this point in his life about purchasing a slave who obviously had come through the slave trade. Her name we know is Venus, at least that's the name they gave her. We don't know her true name, regrettably. We think it actually may have later changed to Leah after the biblical figure, but we're not sure about that. So he had no qualms in 1731 about doing this. But then what happens is, just a decade later, during the Great Awakening, during the revivals, Edwards is rethinking the nature of how the gospel is going to be spread. And he's thinking of this in very millennialistic terms. He was a very firm kind of millennial, post-millennial thinker. And he saw the Great Awakening in these larger terms, in these sort of sacred time. And he came to the conclusion that if the gospel is indeed to have a worldwide kind of acceptance, the slave trade has to stop, because the people being forcibly kidnapped and forcibly and illegally and inhumanely put into slavery would no way accept the gospel. He realized that the whole notion of a Christian view of enslavement or Christian slave ownerships was ludicrous by that time. He had confronted himself about that, and saw that there was an inability to realize justice within that relationship. And the best he could do at this time, though, was to come out against the slave trade as a means of spreading the gospel, right? So he comes out against that. He also criticizes people who may raise objections about people who do own slaves, saying you guys are hypocrites because you actually still partake of the benefits of a slave system. You partake of the benefits of slave labor. You may not own slaves yourself, but he says you have your slaves at next step, right? So he's saying that unless we totally eradicate the slave trade and slavery as a whole, we're nothing but hypocrites if we complain about the enslavement of others. So that was his position by 1741 in the time of the Great Awakening. And more specifically, he's writing this down, this essay that he composed. We have no record that he publicly delivered it, but he composes his thoughts on this just in the following weeks after what was called the New York Slave Revolt. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in the early months of 1741, a so-called slave revolt was detected. There was really no evidence of anything, but it was a very racially charged time, and there were a lot of suspicion of slave revolts occurring, and a number of free and enslaved blacks, as well as some whites, were accused of planning to burn New York City. And in the end, I'm going to say about somewhere between 15 and 20 Black Africans or African Americans were actually burned at the stake for their crimes. One of the few instances in colonial America where people were actually burned at the stake, not for witchcraft, never for witchcraft. That was in Europe. But in America, we burned Black people for supposedly concocting a revolt that apparently was a total fabrication, right? So Edwards is writing in this context. He knows full well about what's happening, has happened in New York City and the trials and so forth. It's reported all over the newspapers, spreads by word of mouth. So the issue of slavery was very much on the minds and consciences of the people of New England and of the New York area at this time, which is, I think, part of what inspires him to write this.
Hey, Dr. I'd like to engage with some of that thought, if you don't mind, at this point.
Sure, of course.
I think it is very helpful to continue to set the historical context for Edwards in his time. I remember reading that this letter, this account in terms of Edwards' thoughts on slavery during this time that you're referencing, Dr. Minkema. And I think that one of the I think overall emotions and assumptions that I walked away with was that it was in fact a further justification for his holding of slaves or his involvement with enslavement, in light of the fact that there were complaints being made against him. It was called out as a disqualifying sin. It was causing all type of disruptions within the church, as he stated himself. And I think two things are very important there as I engage with that letter. One, I mean, it's very important. I think it's one of the only actual accounts that we have of Edwards' views of slavery. But the two things that I walk away with was one, I do think that it was something that we can learn today that we can talk about a little later regarding Edwards' logic there. He calls the whole thing into question, and that is to say, I think it was more of a logical game, if you will, but that is to say that if you're going to lay a claim against me and call me hypocritical for engaging in this institution, then you have to also call yourselves out if you are receiving goods from a system that you are calling out. You receive goods all the time, imported goods or goods that's created right there in the colonies. Exactly. I think that's very important for our time. I think that's very applicable. However, a part of that also is that I think that's one of the great ironies and one of the great disappointments of Edwards on this issue is that Edwards, if anyone that is engaged with Edwards, I mean, his ability to be logically consistent, his philosophical depth, the depth of thought. He can take one thought, he can look at a spider web, he can look at a flower, and he can just go on for pages and pages and pages, which is one of the things I love about his mind. However, on this issue, I thought he was very shallow. Even in that argument that he's making, he doesn't, it's only good enough in as much as it gets the person off his back or it calls the other person to question. However, he doesn't turn the logic on himself. So I don't know if that's, for me, a redeemable letter for himself. I think that it very much allows him to kind of dig a little deeper into the institution of why, let me say this last statement about it. If I can just say it frankly, that this is okay unless we're willing to take the whole thing out. And so I'll say that much. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. But I think that the other part of this is looking at Edwards as a man of his times. I think the reason why this is so important, because I think that the only reason, because part of me and anyone who's engaged Edwards seriously, I mean, you can't deny his genius. And I want to salvage Edwards, However, I don't think that you can salvage Edwards without feeling the full weight of his inconsistencies or his shallowness of thought on this particular issue in comparison to how he thinks so deeply about other issues. And so regarding the man of his times, I think that as an African-American student, I will say that, yes, I think that historical context is very important. And I don't want to be found guilty of chronological snobbery, that just because I'm further along in the line and we don't struggle with those things, that somehow I'm better than him or we're better than him. We have our own issues, as we'll talk about. However, I would say that being a man of his times is still no justification, I think, for his position, because you had people in his times that took opposing thoughts, opposite thoughts. They thought differently. So without a movement, you still had people believing that this was utterly inconsistent. I think even as Samuel Hopkins even thought that in which he followed Edwards. And so, for instance, you had John Wesley, who was a dominant figure in evangelical history at this time, that was utterly opposed to slavery during this time. And then even by the letter that we're referencing right now, there are obviously people within Edwards' network, people that he knew or understood or whatever, the arguments were being made. So I don't think this was a blind spot for Edwards. I think that Edwards simply overlooked it. And I think that if we're going to salvage him, he has to sit under the full weight of that.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
Let
I
me,
agree. He was he felt this was an all or nothing thing, and that everybody was equally culpable. And if you're not willing to give it all up, then the status quo is justified, and that he felt was a good enough argument for that. So it wasn't um, his finest exercise in polemics, that's for sure, especially considering the topic and the cause. So what he's doing there is he's not only defending by implication himself as a slave owner, but he's explicitly defending a fellow clergy person who's been accused by members of his own congregation of being licentious, of being a person who is gratifying his lusts, his greed, because he's a slave owner, right? And as more and more people during this time in New England, especially elites like Edwards, are purchasing slaves for economic reasons, but also for social reasons as kind of markers of social status, this is obviously a direct threat. And another thing we could say about Edwards in this connection is he was a very proactive defender of clerical prerogatives. For all that the Great Awakening in which he was involved was so much about giving voice to the laity, to lay people, to women, to free and enslaved peoples and so forth. He also came down very firmly in defending his professional prerogatives and his class, right? And so in some ways, the issues are linked, it seems to me, that he's not willing to give up either some of the direct markers of his privilege, and he's not willing to kind of descend from the status of his own, not aristocratic, but certainly gentrified and higher or elite position within the society. Because the people who are objecting against slaveholding in that particular community were none of them, members of the higher echelons. They were mostly yeoman farmers and frontier fighters, right? So yeah, I very much agree with your assessment of that particular essay. It's just as well that perhaps that Edwards never had to go public with it.
Yeah. So one thing that Pastor Westbrook mentioned was the John Wesley wrote against slavery. But one thing that I want to mention, just to put him in a chronology, he wrote it in 1770s. He's writing in the 70s. Edwards died in the 50s. And when there were really early abolitionist voices, small Quaker voices, women and others, their younger generation, new generation of Quakers who begin to speak, that was in the 40s. So that will be some sort of similar age with Edwards Jr. and Samuel Hopkins, that generation. So Edward was a bit generation early. So this is getting at this question of, if Edward were to live longer, because as he got older, he did denounce slaves trade, horrific practice. But this gets me to wonder, because Wesley outlived Edwards, 20 years.
By a considerable amount, yeah.
Right. So if Edwards, do you think if he lived to see what was going on, beginning budding of the abolitionist movement, championed by his sons and disciples and so on, if he lived that long, Do you think that he would have taken further steps than he already have?
Well, now, Chris, you're asking me as a historian to answer a counterfactual question.
Yes.
So, but I'll take a swing at it anyway. Okay. So Edwards is definitely a transitional figure in coming out against the slave trade in 1741. That's a fairly early time for any Anglo-American figure to do that. But as you say, it's really not till the 1770s that we start to see something more radical. But I think in the interim, it's important to look very briefly at Edwards's pastorate at Stockbridge, Massachusetts. So after he's dismissed from Northampton in 1750, he becomes a missionary to the Mohican and Mohawk Indians in the Western missionary post at Stockbridge. And he goes there with, I think, a very kind of traditional paternalistic view of the natives, that they have no real culture, they have no real learning or any kind of native intelligence, they have no religion, as defined by in a European context, and so forth. So and indeed they're prone to all sorts of sin, and to violence, not fully recognizing that a lot of the so-called sin to which natives were prone was actually, all caused by their contact with Europeans. That's a whole nother question. But I think as a result of his 6 or 7 years there, I think that he became somewhat more sensitive. Not that he totally abandoned his views. That there's no kind of like there's no kind of like immediate or total transformation here. That doesn't happen a lot in history, does it? Regrettably. But I think he does become more racially sensitive, at least to Native Americans. There, he recognizes certain aspects of their culture. He recognizes their abilities, and he definitely espouses a monogenetical view. That is, that all peoples of the earth are of one blood, of one origin, right? This comes out in his treatise on original sin, where he joins all the human race in original sin, and therefore equally in need of the mercy and grace of God through Christ, right? So it's one of those interesting kind of ironies there, where he sees the unity of all in their sinfulness. But we have to understand too that at this time there were views that espoused what was called ethnogenesis. That is, that there were actually earlier and inferior races before Adam and Eve, right? And those who espoused these ethnogenetical views, as you might expect, said that that Native Americans, that Africans, and so forth, were descended from these earlier created races, right? Edwards had nothing to do with that. But he came to regard, I think, many Native Americans as far superior Christians than many of the English people that he knew. And I think he came to identify with them to a great extent. He had been kind of kicked out of his church for his views, for his principles. He was kind of exiled, put out on the rim of English civilization. And so I think he created kind of an us versus them mentality, identifying with the Native Americans and encouraging them in their own taking up of the Christian message and the Christian life. That's an important step, an important component along the way when we want to consider kind of the arc of Edwards's views on this and where they might have gone. The other piece of this is that his first generation disciples, you mentioned these, Chris, and there are a number of them, but we could focus on especially his son, Jonathan Jr., and one of his first disciples, students, Samuel Hopkins, who were part of an indigenous school of theology called the New Divinity, or they were also called Edwardsians. They explicitly took up Edwards's thought and carried it forward into the revolutionary period. And what they did was they especially picked up on, first of all, Edwards's opposition to the slave trade, but then they took his ethical views, particularly as expressed in The Nature of True Virtue, which Hopkins actually published in 1765. And where Edwards is defining true virtue as love to being in general, that's God and the created order and all fellow beings. Hopkins, Edwards Jr., and other lesser members of the New Divinity turn that into a manifesto for social reform, and particularly for abolition. And so you see Jonathan Jr., Hopkins calling in the early 1770s for the immediate abolition, not only of the slave trade, but of slavery as a whole, as an institution, right?
That's remarkable.
So, these kind of things indicate that if Edwards had lived longer, it's possible that he actually may have been more influenced by his own disciples than he had in this regard. Then he may have been the major mover in this way. It's interesting to speculate about that, but it can only be speculation. But in any case, what's really interesting is to see that his immediate disciples do become immediate abolitionists, but that, like so many other traditions in early America, and this includes the Methodists and other Baptists, unfortunately too, over time, they become much more apologetic. They become much more appeasers of Southern slaveholding. They espouse gradualism, the gradual doing away with slavery at some unspecified point in the future. We're not sure when that's going to be. They espouse colonialization, which is actually sending freed blacks back to Africa. It goes back to this notion of Sewell, right, with the anti-miscegenation attitudes. And this is what brings us into the antebellum period of the early 19th century, where the Edwardsians include, as well as other mainline traditions, are very much involved in appeasing slaveholders because they want to avoid both ecclesiastical and political division, right? But here it is. It's Hopkins and J.E. Jr. who first come out using revolutionary principles, using arguments of natural rights, and using religious language for the first time, saying slavery is a sin. That's really important because what do you do with sin? Well, you repent of it, but you don't repent gradually, you repent immediately and wholly, right? That's what they were saying to America. And so Hopkins is there and Junior is there and others preaching this, and they're holding up the Declaration of Independence and saying, this is a bloody rag if we don't live up to the principles that are declared in this and do away with the sin of slavery. Otherwise, the blood of millions is on our hands. That's almost a direct quote from Hopkins. He was one of the first, I think he may have been the first minister to have actually quoted the Declaration of Independence against slavery.
Interesting.
And he, by the way, he ministered in, guess where? Newport, Rhode Island.
Now,
So he was a real prophet, actually.
Samuel Hopkins actually used Edward's understanding of disinterested benevolence. So this was Edward's idea taken to its logical conclusion or social conclusions.
Yeah, to a great extent. That comes out of, again, the ethical dimensions of the nature of true virtue and the love of benevolence, right? Edwards distinguishes the love of complacence and the love of benevolence. And Hopkins and J.E. Jr. evolved that into disinterested benevolence. That is a selfless kind of giving and loving, right? And they apply that across the board and join that with Republican principles and notions of inalienable rights and equality and so forth, that I think we could learn a lot from still.
Absolutely. Jonathan Edwards, I could see the shift as he especially moved to the wild frontier in the Stockbridge. He's away from his posh congregation in Northampton. And as he, moves to the Indian, his predecessor, John Sargent, had built his cabin away from the Native American, but Edwards built his cabin within the Native American community, daily interacting with them. And I'm sure as he interact with Native American, I wish he was a little more vocal about his evolution of his thinking concerning slaves during this period.
Me too.
Dr. Gainey, I wanted to ask you, what is involved in forgiving a Christian brother who had been complicit in the practice that had damaged and hurt other human life?
Well, as we relate that to the issue of slavery, it is a tough one, Chris, Dr. Chun, because slavery is something that is so deep and the wound is so horrific that forgiveness given in other than words has to find an expression that we have not discovered yet. And what I mean by that is that it continues to emerge, it continues to come up, it continues to rise in terms of the pain and the hurt and just the horrific experience that no one today actually lived through. In other words, we're talking about a period that's 400 years ago, 1472, when the Americas first started seeing slaves brought here. We know in 1619, we have the first permanent slave, but slaves have been coming to the Americas because of the gold and so the Dutch, the Portuguese, 400 years. And so it's a very deep wound. So forgiveness is something that I know I have experienced in my heart, but the wound continues to emerge. The wound continues to rise and to be problematic. And to be honest with you, the greatest hurt comes when I look at the next generation, because I'm over 70 years old now. And so my ability to forgive is a lot more in line, I think, with the gospel than perhaps the younger generation that is still trying to figure out their identity, still trying to figure out their place, and still figure out, how do I relate to the structures that still exist and that allows this pain to continue to be evident in the lives of especially African Americans? It's a tough one. It's a tough one because the forgiveness is not just simply a one-time thing and the healing is there, but it's a continual pain that has emerged and continues to rise, with each new happening. And I do believe, and my hope is that God's going to bring something good out of this, and that we will continue to have dialogues and communication such as what we're having today. And I'm so thankful, that to be on this panel with you, because there are some things that even historically, and all of us have a historical perspective, but we don't all see history the same way. Like when you mention about the abolitionist period, though, that anti-slavery movement that is written about in the 1800s. Well, there was an anti-slavery movement when the first slaves were brought here from Africa. There was rebellion in those very prisons that people were living in as they waited for the weeks and months before they were even transported here to the new lands. And then even after they got here, with the structures that were in place, they kept people on plantations and kept people from getting education and kept people from socializing and coming together with one another. People still rebelled. They had church in the backwoods, in the hush harbors, and in places where it was unimaginable, where they attempted to find some relief from the Lord for their situation. So there was anti-slavery movement that was going on from the perspective of the slave, even though you didn't have the abolitionist movement that was pretty much led by your Quakers and your Mennonites and and others that began to jump on board with that. Even Edward's own son. Your question of would he have evolved or was he evolving? I don't know. I'm not as agreeable on that, because he died in that position in terms of being a slaveholder. I don't remember hearing him freeing any slaves or his own slaves or whatever. I don't remember reading anything about him addressing the structures. And so, in a sense, from my perspective, he is complicit with the situation of that, of that particular day. Now, that doesn't, again, cancel out the good that he did. But I think that the historical record, which it is for everybody, we should see both sides. And oftentimes that side is not brought out in clarity, because the person who's under the underdog is not doing the writing or the interpretation of that particular context.
I think I greatly appreciate that perspective. It's very important to recognize the acts of resistance that Africans and African Americans themselves engaged in over time, right from the beginning. So yes, thank you for that.
Pastor Westbrook, You are a pastor of diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multi-socio-economic congregation in Oakland and San Francisco Bay Area. And the question that I want to ask you is that can an African American pastor learn from Edwards' ministerial practice? I'm thinking both positive and negatively, you know. And another follow up to that question is, have you been have you ever implemented anything that you learned from Edwards in your ministerial setting?
Mm. Yeah, no, I think that the answer is yes and yes. I think that I've learned it's hard not to learn and glean from someone that you've studied, you know, and studying Edwards, I've gleaned much from him. Um, and I think that the thing that I can appreciate about him and looking at some of the good that Dr. Gainey is talking about, as well as obviously allowing him to sit under the full weight of his decisions. Because actually, I agree with Dr. Gainey on that. I think that some of the arguments that Samuel Hopkins is actually making, some of the language he's using, it's almost as if it's pinned against Edwards in terms of this ideal of the Bible does not contradict itself. And when Samuel Hopkins, in terms of the allowance for slavery, and Samuel Hopkins lays out an argument that says that our involvement in this institution is an act of contradictory. So I think the words that he's using there may be actually specifically to demonstrate where he actually disagreed with Edwards on this issue. And so, but that's just the thing. Let's just say that for me, as Dr. Gainey said, I think that if he did not free his slaves, I think that really shows where he kind of stood on the matter. But there could be great evolution as to how he felt or the reasons that justified him doing it in the first place. Those scholarship is a game of nuance, and I think that there's probably great nuance there. With that said, I think that's important when it comes to how he has influenced my ministry. Because it's like I said earlier, it's in that tension that I can say that I can hold him accountable for his view and involvement in this institution. But Edwards and his contribution to Christian thought has been very influential in my life specifically. Edward was a great philosophical mind, but he was very great practical mind as well. He didn't, when I engaged him, because I was a philosophical studies major, as I've mentioned before, I read thinkers who were very lofty and no earthly good, if you will. And with Edwards is that he can be very lofty in terms of being able to take a thought from beginning and take it to its natural consequence. But it was very practical. For instance, I think about his work in the second volume, I believe, on the preciousness of time and how to redeem the time, how he was very particular and very disciplined about his time as a pastor. His thoughts on procrastination, his thoughts even on eating. This is a person who was thought very seriously about his diet because he did not want anything affecting his ability to think clearly. I think that all of those things, in light of especially the American diet, these are very helpful things that I have used naturally. I think also the last thing here is that thinking. One thing that I can really appreciate about Edwards is that how he thought about things. Now, I thought that once again, I think he gets an F for how he thought about slavery because it wasn't as dense and it wasn't as rich as his other thoughts. But I think that you see the fruit of that with Hopkins and with Junior, the ability to think and carry things out to their necessary ends, which is probably why you can get them picking up with the abolition where Edwards stopped. And I say that when I approach my sermons, you can probably you can thank Edwards for my 50-minute long sermons because I just can't put a thought down because I have to carry it out. There's great density to me. No, I don't preach that long, but and so no, of course he's influenced my ministry. Yes.
Okay. Well, this next question that I have is for Dr. Gainey as well as Pastor Westbrook. Yes, Edward had great ideas. Love the scripture. But how do we expect our audience, they're watching today, uh, to like somebody like Edwards who owned African slave? Can we still learn and still read and learn from a person like that?
Well, I only have something very small to say here, and if I can go first, I'll let Dr. Gainey end this point. Um, I, the way I approach this is I would not I could not take I can't take seriously, or well, that's not accurate. You can take it seriously, but you can just simply agree with it or not. I simply don't agree with his approach on you know, non-Euro peoples. I think that's historical true fact that are evidence that he evolved on some of these things, some of these views. His view on slavery, obviously, I think that's been overstated already. That I won't agree with that. I don't agree with it. However, I don't go to Edwards for him to form my perspective of slavery. I disagree with it. That's already stated. There's much more to Edwards in terms of his contribution, and those are the things that I would encourage people to grapple with if they will. Now, I don't think it's my job to try to get people to like Edwards. I think that people they are where they are. They have to think through Edwards and come down to the conclusion they're going to come down to. I hope that they are fair in that analysis. I hope that they are historically grounded in that analysis. That is not based on just speculation, but facts. I think anything that's fair to any human. However, I will say that there's so much that I do think that we can grapple with regarding Edwards. And let me say this, in my agreement that this was a deplorable institution, from those that were kidnapped, from those that were sold on the continent of Africa, and to those that transported us in this horrible middle voyage, and even those that participated. I do believe that to the slave, there may be a nuanced statement that is appropriate here. And while I'm sure that there's no slave in their right mind, at least, that would say that slavery for me is good. I do think it matters how the slave is treated when they are enslaved. So essentially what I'm referring to here is that the institution of slavery, I think, is deplorable. But what do you do when you have it? I think that it does matter how you treat the slave. And it's a question that I have that I think is important is, in light of this institution, how did Edwards treat those that he participated with enslaving? I think that's very important, because I think that would have been very important to a very important question to Venus and to the others that he purchased as well. How will this man treat me? And I think that with that said, that doesn't get him off the hook. It doesn't justify anything. But I think that if it's at all possible for you to treat a person humanely while participating in this institution, I think that that needs to be considered when we're talking about whether or not we should continue to read Edwards or not.
Dr. Gainey, can we still read and learn from a person like him?
I think not only can we learn and read and should read from a person like Jonathan Edwards, I think also too, there are others out there that obviously fit the same mode, as well as those who formulated our Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, because I think the ideals that these individuals had, even though they may not have been practiced to the extent that they should have been. I think that the ideals are still there. I think that the notion of love and care, these are things that I can learn from as an African-American theologian in this day, in this time, where there is a shift that is obviously taking place, where I have decisions that I have to make, and whose side do I see myself falling on? And the primary thing that I am most concerned with, of which I think everyone who is a Christian needs to ask, is what side is Jesus on? And I do believe that Jesus is on the side of love. I do believe that Jesus is on the side of forgiveness. I just need to continue to work on how to do that, how to work that out. And perhaps Edwards was trying to do that the best that he could do in the context that he was in. I'm in another context, and I don't have those excuses. I know better. And so I certainly can't run to the side and say, I hate all of those people because of what they did to my grandparents and my great-grandparents. I cannot take that position because I know better. And I also have a context now which allows me to respond differently. In my writing, in my preaching, and in my churchmanship. You know, I applaud people like my pastor, brother there, who, you know, is doing a multicultural church. And I think that says so much. Why does that say so much? Because that is the essence of the gospel. You know, that one day, this is what heaven is going to look like. Well, if that's what heaven is going to look like, then I should be practicing that right down here, right now. I think that is one thing I can say. I don't know so much about Edwards' practice in private with his slaves, but it does appear that he was trying to bring them into the church. Maybe not as full members, maybe not as full rights of everybody, but there was the attempt to do that. Well, I believe that that's what Jesus was trying to do, get us all to come into the church. And I don't mean the Southern Baptist Church, but I'm talking about the church that Christ builds, that is built upon his cornerstone. And so that must be made up of all people, regardless of what the historical record speaks about. There is still an ideal that is greater than anything that we have come through, greater than anything that we have experienced. And that greater ideal says that in the end, we're going to all be glorifying and praising his name together. So regardless of the difficulty and the challenge of doing that, now we don't have a right to cancel anybody, because there's none among us who is without sin. Yeah. And we don't move all the way to the other side of this argument, where we start saying this person was the wrong color, so just get rid of them. There's none who is 100% good. We find the good, and we also find the bad, and we lift up those, and we start doing better than the generation before us. And I think therein is where I see my answers.
So
Go
ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say that I would not be one to cancel Jonathan Edwards, but I would be one to say I have learned from the historical record and even from his own situation how to do this thing called being a child of Jesus Christ better. I love my brother better. And that's not just my brother who is Black, but my brother who is white, my brother who is Asian, my brother who is Latino. I've learned how to do that better, and it's still not perfect.
Okay.
But I think that I've learned enough to say that we can all do better.
Right. Thank you. Pastor Westbrook, how should we respond to a person who wants to cancel Edwards? Dr. Gainey has given his perspective. I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah. You're gonna get me on the soapbox here, so I'll try to keep my words limited right now. I think that this cancellation culture is a very dangerous one. I think that we have forgotten how to live in tension. We've forgotten how to actually weigh matters, and cancellation is a very, I think, easy, often shallow way of responding to things that we disagree with or may not like, and I think that it has to do with I think what one author wrote, with the coddling of the American mind. I think that there's a lot to be said there, and that is not to like I said, once again, exonerate those that were culturally complicit with something that is deplorable, but is to simply say that we shouldn't be so ready to cancel Edwards, namely, lest we be ready to counsel ourselves. And here's what I mean by that. When I look at Edwards and what we're actually describing regarding Clay Feet and his understanding and his convictions about slavery, I would say that I think that what he actually wrote about slavery was very helpful, because I think that it may be self-condemning for him if you carry it all out. However, what he says is actually true regarding how we are all complicit with things in our age, and how we have to be very careful. I actually like, I'm going to read something that he wrote here that I think is very helpful to this end, and with that letter that he wrote. He says that their argument, if it carries anything, implies that we ought not to be partakers, neither immediately nor remotely. We ought not to be partakers at all. If they don't mean so, but only mean by so many steps, they would do well to fix the numbers of steps. And besides, they don't know, but that they are partakers as immediately as we. They may have their slaves at next step. So this is what we referred to earlier, that everyone is somehow complicit with this, because I may have slaves directly, but you have slaves indirectly because you're receiving goods from slavery. I think about things in our modern age, like, we have Halloween coming up tomorrow. And so it makes me think about candy. I think about things like Hershey's, Mars. I think about the clothing that we wear, Levi jeans. I'm calling out people here. And there's so many names that I can call out regarding how slave labor is used to produce these things. People that are even paid low wage, which is almost as slave wages, making pennies a day, and then slave-like conditions. There's so many layered realities there in terms of, can a person just leave that situation? Do they have to stay there? In this generation, we are complicit with so much of the horrors that happens in third world countries. And I think that that's something to be said there. And years later, generations, I think people are coming to be awakened to these things. But the question is, are we simply blind to these things, or are we just simply overlooking them? And I would say that there's much that I'm not blind to. And I say that to my own horror, that, am I ready? I have conversations with myself, as all humans do. Am I ready to give this up? And I don't think that in tomorrow's generation, that would be quite understandable. So here's why I say we have to be careful with the reasons that we counsel people, lest we be counseling ourselves. And I don't want to be hypocritical in this life, or be two-faced on issues. I don't think that we should counsel Edwards. I think that there's enough there that proves. And listen, I've studied many figures in history, looking at antebellum South, looking. My study was antebellum, Civil War, and Reconstruction. Those were the periods, but primarily reconstruction is where I concentrated on. And I got to tell you that there is a flavor of uh, enslavement from Christians that I will say that I don't necessarily recognize with Edwards. While there's many components that's there, I think that Edwards is salvageable.
Indeed. Well, thank you for all of your thoughts. It's something for us to ponder. I've certainly learned a lot. The purpose of today's talk, as you can see, was not to sanitize Jonathan Edwards. Our point was not excusing Edwards' slaveholding, but how we can understand Edwards in his historical context without justifying his participation in slaveholding. But before labeling him as a slaveholder or canceling him, I want our audience to understand that Edward was in a very different context from our world today. The 17th and 18th century, in some sense, were harsh and barbaric time. I mean, had a contaminating effect on everyone. And just as Pastor Westbrook has mentioned, we're contaminated by the evils of our time. But every generation has their own blind spot. Indeed. But the blind spot of our other generations may be different from our own. I agree with many of what Dr. Gainey said. History clearly sees today that Edward's complicity in this institution of slavery was dead wrong. But we should also understand the context of his age, that he lived in those periods. So even as we unequivocally just render judgment on Edwards, what he did was wrong, we also need to accurately describe the time in which he lived and what contributed to his complicity to it. And I'm grateful for Dr. Minkema to highlight that. We talked about people like Edward's disciple, Samuel Hopkins, Jonathan Edwards Jr., were some of the earliest and most ardent voices in abolitionist movement in what later became the United States of America. As Dr. Minkema has mentioned, yes, Edward was slaveholder, but he was also on the journey on this issue. As a historian, we don't go there much with counterfactual history, but I do wonder, as he grew up, he defended slavery, owning slaves, but as he got older and as he went to Stockbridge and so on, he came to denounce the slave trade, and had he lived longer in Stockbridge, lived as long as Wesley did in the 1770s and onward, I wonder if he would have taken further steps. That said, that's interesting speculation, but after all said and done, at the end of the day, we must acknowledge that Edward was a slave owner, and we cannot and should not fully exonerate him from that past. But even as we say it is wrong, we should also accurately describe the situation and ask the question why it occurred. In studying history, I like to be as sympathetic as I can to the setting. At the same time, we should also reserve the judgment from our point of view today. I actually say this because someday I want people to do that for us. 300 years later, one day people will say, those people who live in early 21st century, they did some bad things. Every generation had their own mistakes, but our mistakes are different from theirs. If a godly person like Jonathan Edwards, who loved the scripture, who wrote about the beauty of God, the glories of God, who authored the nature of true virtues and religious affection, if somebody like that was so blind to the great sin of his generation, I want to ask us, I wonder, How about us?
Mm.
How about those who live in the 21st century? Well, our time is running out here. So I just want to thank all the members of our panel discussion. My special thanks to Dr. Minkema, special thanks to Dr. Gainey and Pastor Westbrook. And I want to thank all of you who are watching this important discussion today at Jonathan Edwards Center at Gateway Seminary. Have a wonderful, wonderful week.